For 3 decades, Johnny Carson's monologue and desk routine looked effortless, the same reliable rhythm every night. But offstage, the picture was messy, eh? Staffers have long claimed that Carson could size up a guest condition the instant they stepped through the curtain, reading in seconds whether someone had been drinking, smoking, or worse. According to people who worked the show in the 1970s, his crew even developed a private signal system. A touch of the tie during introduction supposedly meant this guest isn't sober, while straightening his cue cards twice told the director to keep the camera work simple because the segment might go off the rails. The claim, repeated by several former staffers over the years, is that some of the era's biggest names, Oscar winners, rock legends, celebrated writers, occasionally arrived barely able to keep track of their own train of thought, and that Carson had to carry the interview while quietly managing a guest who was somewhere else entirely. One frequently cited, if unverified, story involves a beloved star who seemed so obviously altered that NBC executives supposedly considered cutting away mid-segment, until Carson convinced them the audience simply thought it was a bit. The Tonight Show's green room reportedly saw more pre-show nerves than almost any space in television. Carson wasn't a soft interviewer. A strong appearance could make a career, and a weak one could follow a performer for years. Because he preferred loose, unrehearsed conversation rather than tightly scripted exchanges, guests often felt exposed walking out to face him, and that anxiety, insiders say, pushed them toward a drink or something stronger before hitting the stage. The Green Room bar was said to be well-stocked with top-shelf liquor, personally approved by Carson, with an unofficial and rarely enforced house rule of 1 drink being fine and 2 being pushing it. Beyond alcohol, the loosened cultural attitudes of the era, the studio 54 years, when recreational drug use ran through much of entertainment and even Wall Street, reportedly meant a fair number of guests had already indulged before arriving. Carson himself enjoyed a drink, but was famously disciplined on camera, which made for an interesting contrast when the person across the desk clearly wasn't exercising the same restraint. Former colleagues describe him as skilled at reading a guest state and adjusting on the fly, gently steering someone who was mildly loosened up, simplifying questions for someone more impaired, and trimming segments short when needed, all while trying to make it look natural. George Carlin's transformation from clean-cut comic to counterculture figure in the early 70s came with a new look, new material, and, according to people who worked his segments, an openly relaxed, faintly glassy-eyed demeanor that became almost part of his stage persona. He was never especially secretive about it. Carlin appeared on the show more than 130 times and was considered one of Carson's most dependable guests, yet he was reportedly never tapped to guest host, a role many of his peers received. The suggested reason, performer staff, wasn't lack of affection. Carson reportedly liked him a great deal, but doubt about whether his lifestyle made him reliable enough to anchor a full 90-minute broadcast. What set Carlin apart by these accounts was that his substance use didn't derail his performance. He stayed sharp and funny, just visibly mellower. Staffers described him as a functioning user whose relaxed state seemed to feed his free associative, philosophical riffing rather than undercut it. Carson reportedly adapted his interview style accordingly, tossing out broad topics and letting Carlin's mind wander into the loose, often brilliant tangents that defined his act. Carlin later addressed the speculation directly in his memoir, essentially confirming that he was often high during his Carson appearances in the 70s and treating it as an unremarkable fact of the era. Where Carlin represented steady, functional use, Richard Pryor's appearances were described as more volatile. A comic who could be the funniest person in the room one moment and mentally somewhere else entirely the next. Pryor's well-documented struggles with cocaine intensified through the decade, culminating in his notorious 1980 accident, and several of his Tonight Show spots reportedly captured him at different points along that arc. One frequently cited 1978 appearance is said to have started normally, with Pryor discussing his current projects, before a childhood anecdote gradually dissolved into disconnected asides, his attention visibly drifting while the audience laughed uncertainly, unsure whether it was intentional. Staffers described Carson stepping in with a redirecting question, a covering joke, and a smooth pivot to commercial, handled by their account as deaf crisis management disguised as ordinary conversation. People close to the show describe Carson as genuinely fond of Pryor and non-judgmental about the substance use itself, while privately worried about where it might lead, reportedly checking in on him through mutual friends after rougher appearances. The through line in these accounts is unpredictability. Pryor's talent stayed intact, but his focus could shift without warning, and Carson's approach was to let him run when things were working and pull him back the moment they weren't. Not every account involves comedians. Truman Capote's January 1980 appearance is remembered by several former staffers as a rare, full-blown disaster. Capote had been a reliable, witty guest for years, but this appearance was reportedly different from the moment he walked out, slurring badly, his head nodding forward before jerking back to attention, to the point that the control room allegedly leaned on reaction shots of Carson simply because they were more coherent than anything happening on the other side of the desk. Unlike his patience with Carlin or Pryor, Carson's on-air demeanor toward Capote is described as visibly tighter. A strained smile, simplified questions, an obvious effort to get through the segment. Off camera, the story goes, he was furious, telling the talent booker flatly that Capote wouldn't be back. What reportedly bothered him wasn't impairment itself, but the degree of it. The difference between a guest who's loosened up but still functional and one who is, by these accounts, barely conscious. The incident is credited with prompting tighter backstage monitoring of guest condition and more careful oversight of the green room bar. And Capote apparently never returned to the show during Carson's run, becoming one of a small handful of performers given an effective lifetime ban. Some guests never bothered hiding it. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong built their entire act around cannabis culture, and former staffers describe Carson leaning into that rather than working around it. Playing an exaggerated straight man, feigning confusion at their drug references, and letting their stoner bits play out rather than steering away from them. During one appearance promoting Up in Smoke, Chong reportedly wandered into a rambling, disconnected story about the film, and instead of redirecting him, Carson simply let it run, occasionally throwing the audience a knowing glance. The read from people who worked those episodes is that Carson wasn't exposing the duo so much as authenticating their brand, signaling to the audience that they were exactly who they appear to be. It's described as a mutual arrangement. Carson enjoyed their honesty, and they appreciated not being pushed into a sanitized television version of themselves. Peter Fonda's 1970 appearance is remembered as one of the odder outings in the show's history. Already known for Easy Rider and his open embrace of psychedelics, Fonda reportedly arrived showing signs staffers associated with LSD, dilated pupils, a fixation on the studio lights and his own hands, and a habit of answering questions roughly 30 seconds after they were asked. Carson is said to have shifted quickly into simple, neutral questioning and looked for the earliest graceful exit. The breaking point, according to the story, came when a routine question about upcoming projects led Fonda into a monologue about time not being linear, but wrapped around us like a blanket. Carson reportedly gave a prearranged signal, tapping his cards twice, cutting to commercial roughly 5 minutes into what was meant to be a 12-minute segment. When the show returned, Fonda had simply been swapped out for the next guest, with no explanation given. By this account, Carson wasn't upset afterward, just practical, suggesting they give Fonda another shot down the road, which they reportedly did, with more conventional results. Not every impaired appearance played for laughs. British actor Oliver Reed's 1975 visit is remembered as the moment things turned from amusing to genuinely tense. Reed, already known for a hard-drinking reputation, arrived visibly intoxicated, and what began as slurred but manageable answers escalated as he grew louder and more erratic. At one point reportedly standing up and demonstrating a fighting stance, prompting security to move closer to the stage. Former crew members described Carson's demeanor shifting from amused to guarded in real time, taking firmer control of the conversation, interrupting Reed's tangents, and cutting the segment noticeably short. The account draws a clear line for Carson. Being drunk or high was tolerable if a guest could still function, but aggression or unpredictable hostility was not. Reed reportedly was never invited back, joining a very short list of performers effectively banned from the show. Some appearances generated speculation without any obvious on-air disaster. Sammy Davis Jr.'s 1974 interview is remembered for its unusually frantic energy, talking rapidly, unable to sit still, jumping between thoughts, sweating more than usual under the lights. While much of the audience likely read it as simply an enthusiastic performer being himself, some industry insiders reportedly recognized the pattern as consistent with cocaine use, which had become increasingly common in entertainment circles by the mid-70s. By these accounts, Carson never addressed it directly, on air or off, though he's said to have made a light, joking comment about secondhand exhaustion once the segment ended. What distinguished this appearance from